Welcome, future masters! It's time for another exciting installment of King and Pawn Action Theater. So make sure you like this video. It's going to be pretty awesome. So this guy played G4. Then what I had to look at here is how to figure out which compartments we have to manufacture to win this. So the thing that comes to mind immediately is that if we exchange on the dark squares, he's going to exchange pawns on the light, and vice versa. If I take the light pawn, he'll take the dark pawn. And so I looked at this and I thought, well, I would rather have him conceptually exchanging towards my king, which brings the material to win closer. So if I take this e pawn, d5 takes e pawn on the light squares. He takes king e6. I'm going to just eat this pawn, and then we're going to have 3 versus 3 versus 1 on the king side against his single pawn, and we have an opportunity, hopefully, to turn 3 versus 1 into 2 versus 0, because there's a special piece of information. A lot of you guys will know this, but some of you won't. And that was the whole thing. So the thing that makes this whole work is that our king is blocking this pawn. He's neutralized for, at this point, he could play b4 and b5 and he still can't queen. So we could basically get 2 free moves of this pawn to do whatever we want before it becomes a threat where our king has to chase it down. So this pawn is the distant pass pawn, meaning it's the pawn furthest away from the cluster of the main pawns. So it could become a threat if you're not paying attention. Fortunately, I'm a master and then some at King and Pawn Endgames. So I decided to take on the light squares because it makes pawn on e5 complete meat for my king. So this all went according to plan, and like I said, now it really simplifies matters. You see, this distant pass pawn is a potential threat, but he's not a threat to me until he makes the third move of that pawn, so forget that. Here comes Big Charlie, king to e6. So he is kind of like, he can't run the pawn. If he runs the b pawn, I'm just going to chop this off. He moves it again, and I'm going to set up my unbeatable formation. So he's got to try and corral the e pawn. This pawn now have achieved the goal that I was looking to get, which is winning a pawn. And now we have 3 versus 1 on the king side, an easy victory if we can set up, if we have the time to set up the chain. We need to pawn chain this guy here. If we don't pawn chain to this e pawn, we're in trouble. So the only way to do it, let me show you the way not to do it. This is a case of deductive logic. In deductive logic, if I go, hey, let's make a pawn chain, g6 and f5, sounds good. g6, crunch, g5, uh-oh. That would stop that. Now, it probably doesn't stop it. It might, but it's close. So, knowing this trap of playing g6, he plays g5, that is the best move for sure. And so knowing this concept, we're going to have to go and sneak up f6, g6, f5. This is the hard lesson you learn at some point. And if you don't know it, you know it today. g6 question mark, maybe double question mark. Terrible move. The idea is good, but the execution fails because he's going to play g5. And if you go after this g5, king f5, b4, yeah, you can't take this pawn because when he plays b5, you're dead. So this is g6 double question mark. Worst move on the board. Well, okay, e3 is probably worse. But so we have to baby step this. f6, and if he attacks, he needs to attack our pawn with this king. Like I said, he can move this pawn, doesn't do any good. You know, f6, b4, g6, b5, and I head to the pawn because his king's not attacking my pawn. And then once he stops pushing his pawn and goes king to e3, f5, and he's crushed. So f6 is the way to do it. You got to baby step this guy. So we're going to put the f6 baby step on him. Now he's attacking my pawn. This doesn't look, f6 does not look like the right move. You look at this, f6 does not jump out at you unless you are a master and then some on king and pawn endgames. Because like I said, g6, g5, and you're at best a draw. You might be just outright losing because the pawn formation is terrible. So you got to learn about the baby step. Today you're learning to take the baby step. Now he's in trouble. b4, g6, b5, f5. We have established our pawn chain. Once we establish the pawn chain, he's dead. That's the thing, and I'm going to show you why. b4, that's the best move. g6, the best move. b5, best move. Establish the pawn chain. Now, whether he takes it or not is irrelevant. His king can never capture this f-pawn. Takes it, he takes it, it's fine. Now, we win because this king, notice, is in the square. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 by 4 square. The king is in the corner of the square. This pawn has been neutralized. And his king, he can push this pawn. We go after it. So b6, king d6. He can go king to f4 for all we care. He can never take f5 because we just queen. So this is the key. You've got to know way back here. I saw this way back here. I'm going to build the pawn chain on e4, f5, and g6. But I wanted to show you the pawn chain concept that we're trying to get before I told you I'm going to set up this pawn chain because that would complicate the issue. So again, now you see after g4, our whole goal is to set up this pawn chain. So we clearly need to take d takes e4 so that we'll have the g, f, and e files with pawns on it to make a pawn chain. So that is the entire goal. And like I said, we're going to win this pawn. That's fine. Nothing he can do about it. And then the master move here, f6, the baby step. So this is really, really useful information on king and pawn endgames. And it's funny, it's taken me way longer to explain the intricacies of this to you guys than it did for me to actually do it. I did it in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. But this is because I have done all this work that I'm explaining to you guys. If you don't do this work or have it explained to you, it's super impossible to figure this out. Experience factor of setting up this pawn chain is not obvious. It's really not obvious. When I looked at it, it wasn't obvious. I had to like go through the deal at the very beginning. So hopefully this is super important stuff. This is going to help some of you for sure. Go through it a couple of times, whatever, to understand what's going on. So like the video, man. Tell your buddies. I will see you guys later. It's under 10 minutes. Killer.